Hello, and welcome to the Scope of Things podcast, a no-nonsense look at the promise and problems of clinical research based on a sweep of the latest news and emerging trends in the field, and what I think is worthy of your 30 or so minutes of time. I'm Deborah Borfitz, senior science writer for Clinical Research News, which means I spend a lot of time with my ear to the ground on your behalf and a lot of hours every week speaking to top experts from around the world. Please consider making this your trusted go-to channel for staying current on things that matter, whether they give us hope or cause for pause. In another 5 minutes or so, I'll be speaking to Benjamin Vandendriessche, Chief Delivery Officer for the Digital Medicine Society, about a new set of resources for validating novel digital clinical measures. But first, the latest news, including an investigation into data reporting problems in a landmark clinical trial, the need for more sex-aware cancer research, Alzheimer's-related studies looking at brain shrinkage associated with immunotherapies and the repurposing of drugs as potential new treatments, and a large decentralized trial that succeeded in uncovering disease-causing genetic variants in hundreds of participants. The BMJ launched an investigation finding problems in data reporting in the landmark PLATO clinical trial AstraZeneca used to gain worldwide approval for its anti-platelet drug Ticagrelor, better known as Brilinta in the United States. Trial results published in the New England Journal of Medicine back in 2009. The FDA approved the drug 2 years later, despite vocal objections from a medical officer with the agency, and a host of other studies since then have failed to replace PLATO's positive results. Critics cite inconsistencies and anomalies in the data that led to a short-lived U.S. Justice Department investigation that they hope will be reopened. A co-author of U.S. guidelines recommending Ticagrelor is now calling for a reappraisal of that decision. Among findings of the BMJ investigation are a failure to analyze overall primary endpoint results for patients at sites monitored by CROs and discrepancies related to patient deaths, pointing to the possibility of unblinding. A groundbreaking new database has shined light on how biological sex can comprehensively impact cancer onset, progression, and therapeutic outcomes, and address a significant gap in current research. The so-called Oncosexome Project documents sex-based differences in cancer treatment efficacy, biomarkers, risk factors, and microbial influences across 71 cancer types. Most cancer clinical trials have historically overlooked sex differences, and many of those that curated post-treatment sex comparisons uncovered important differences in treatment outcomes. The National Institutes of Health has mandated the inclusion of sex as a biological variable in research proposals since 2016, the goal being to avoid a one-size-fits-all approach to cancer care. The online database provides both internal and external contributors to cancer and has an interactive, user-friendly interface, making it an essential tool for translating sex-differentiated data into actionable insights for future sex-aware cancer research. Researchers in the UK are calling for better reporting in clinical trials of brain shrinkage associated with new immunotherapies for Alzheimer's disease, which appear to be a sign of effectiveness rather than harm. After analyzing data from a dozen trials of amyloid-targeting immunotherapy, they found that the excess brain volume loss was caused by the removal of amyloid plaques rather than the loss of neurons or brain tissue, allaying concerns that the drugs could be causing unrecognized toxicity. They also coined a new phrase to describe the phenomenon: amyloid removal-related pseudo-atrophy. Whether this will help bolster the case to have the NHS cover the cost of lecanemab, recently approved in the UK and marketed under the brand name Leqembi, is anyone's guess. Meanwhile, Alzheimer's researchers in the US have unraveled how microglia, specialized immune cells that patrol the brain, can transform and drive harmful processes like neuroinflammation and tau buildup. They took a network-based approach to the creation of an algorithm combining publicly available RNA sequencing datasets and protein-protein interaction data, chemical and drug databases, and data on millions of insured individuals to identify drugs already approved by the FDA that could be repurposed to target only the disease-associated subtypes of microglia. They also identified 3 unique subtypes of the harmful microglia, each having its own genetic signature. The computational exercise pointed to ketorolac, used to treat mild to moderate pain, as a potential treatment that they now plan to look at in a clinical validation study. And finally, the Mayo Clinic recently reported results of the Tapestry study, its largest ever decentralized clinical trial conducted remotely through electronic contact, education, and consent, with sample collection materials delivered to participants' homes. The study analyzed DNA from over 100,000 people from diverse backgrounds, generating a comprehensive collection of exome data that includes genes that code for proteins. The focus was on disease-causing genetic variants linked to hereditary breast and ovarian cancer syndrome, Lynch syndrome, and familial hypercholesterolemia. Nearly 2,000 people carried at least one of the genetic variants, and notably, about 65 of those individuals had no known prior personal or family history of the conditions. Those insights are being integrated into participants' health records to guide future medical decisions. The genetic database with linked clinical data will also allow Mayo's research community to rapidly identify suitable trial participants based on the specific genetic profiles and medical histories. A link to each of the reference studies can be found in the show notes. It is now time to bring in the Digital Medicine Society's Benjamin Vandendriessche to talk about a newly completed project with the FDA that is providing much-needed guidance and resources on how to go about validating novel digital clinical measures. Welcome to the show, Ben, and a belated Happy New Year to you.
Very happy to be here, and a Happy New Year to you, too.
Thank you. It would probably be helpful, Ben, if you could start us off with a brief recap of this public-private partnership. I know the end goal is to accelerate the adoption of digital endpoints in trials, but how does this initiative help get us there?
Let me start maybe by briefly explaining the title of the project, because it's a bit of a mouthful, right?
Okay.
The keyword is novel in validating novel digital clinical measures. Nowadays, it's possible to measure symptoms of disease that were never captured before with digital health technologies, which is great because they truly have the potential to measure aspects of health that matter to patients and therefore put us on a path to develop more impactful treatments, especially for complex and chronic conditions. However, they're novel, right? So it's also harder to establish that these measures are appropriate and fit for purpose, because the ability to say that depends to a large extent on comparing your digital clinical measure against a reference measure, which may simply not be available. And so the resources that we just launched include a step-by-step guide that lays out essentially a decision-making process to systematically identify the most rigorous reference measure that is appropriate for your context of use, or if those are not available, how to design one. And completing the various steps in the decision process really gives you a clear starting point to have a conversation with others, such as pharma sponsors and regulators, about your approach. So that's one, let's say, half of the resources. The other half includes recommendations about how to go about the statistical analysis of your measure, right? Because you need to conduct a comparative analysis if you're comparing to a reference measure. And when you're dealing with an existing reference, that is a fairly well-established field, but for novel measures, it is not. And in that part of the resources, we include a simulation toolkit, which is hosted on GitHub, that will help biostatisticians game out certain analysis scenarios before getting started on an actual study implementation. And so kind of like taken together, like by creating this more harmonized approach, we believe that these resources really solve one of the last remaining scientific hurdles that have hampered the adoption of digital endpoints in clinical trials, ultimately leading to new therapies reaching patients. And as usual, with all things that DIME produces, all of these resources are open access, available on our website.
Right. Okay. Now, the Digital Medicine Society, popularly known as DIME, as you just mentioned, it previously put out this so-called V3 framework like 5 years ago as a resource for evaluating the quality of digital clinical measures. So could we dig in a little bit on what was missing in there that is being addressed with this new set of guidance documents?
Yeah, absolutely. And so the V3 framework, since it was published, has been adopted by many, and it kind of turned into a rather seminal piece of work for the field. And for listeners who are not familiar, V3 stands for verification, analytical validation, and clinical validation. And what it does is it acknowledges that in order to assess if a sensor-based digital health technology is fit for purpose, we need to lean both on, let's say, more traditional verification and validation engineering concepts, as well as validation concepts that are being borrowed from biomarker development. As a quick sidebar, by the way, this year we actually published an update on V3 called V3 Plus. It does not in any way change the original V3 framework, but it adds the concept of usability validation as an important additional evaluation lens, if you will, to evaluate digital health technologies. Mm-hmm. So that's V3. And then we have this work, right? Which is about validating novel digital clinical measures, and it's essentially augmenting the concept of analytical validation. So analytical validation is the step that you take to assess that the performance of an algorithm that is processing data captured by a sensor is of the level that you need it to be, right? And this step typically relies on having one or more reference measures available to do that comparative analysis. So let's say that you have a sensor-based wearable digital health technology that quantifies blood pressure, and an appropriate reference measure could be an automated blood pressure cuff, right? An emphasis on could there, because it will depend on your context of use. And that's like going step by step through all of these requirements and decisions you need to make is exactly what these resources do in order to help you identify an appropriate reference measure of the highest possible rigor for your analytical validation study. I alluded to the fact that in the case of novel measures, it's not unlikely that reference measures may not exist, right? And for those scenarios, we've defined the concept of a novel comparator, which are observations made by either a healthcare professional or self-reported by a trial participant that literally generate a reference measure from scratch. Now, of course, that step still relies on the ability to identify an observable measure in units that are comparable to those of your measure of interest. Because if that's not there, it's you can't really conduct analytical validation and run that comparative analysis. So in cases where that is not possible either, the decision process allows you to then identify a so-called anchor measure, which do not have to be in comparable units. But it is important to call out that that's really a last resort solution. And if it can be avoided, it should be avoided, because the rigor of that is absolutely lower than that of a novel comparator or an existing reference measure.
Well, there's a lot of new terms for me. But since this is a partnership with the FDA, I have to ask, is any of this in any sense mandatory for technology developers and study sponsors to follow, or should that be the expectation down the road?
So currently, following these resources is not mandatory, but as you pointed out, they were indeed developed in close collaboration with FDA under a PPP, private-public partnership model. And in addition, we had many other subject matter experts who added their voice to the project, which included biostatisticians from across the industry, digital health technology developers, all of that to emphasize that the resources weren't created in a vacuum and they solve a real need and directly address barriers to adoption of digital endpoints observed by both FDA and pharma sponsors and other stakeholders in this entire process. And it's like you refer to the fact that there's a lot of new terms here, and that's kind of the point here, right? Like there absolutely is a very specific field here, and it's not always easy, whether you're new or very experienced, to kind of find your way. And so when developing these initial reference measures, or at least the initial framework that codifies how to go about selecting a good reference measure, we actually considered putting more quantitative requirements in to establish the kind of reference measure that is appropriate, right? Like what level of quantitative threshold do you need to reach in order to say something about the rigor of a measure? Eventually, we decided against that, as we feel it would have made the framework too restrictive in what is essentially still a very rapidly developing field. And so from that perspective, the voluntary aspect is a strength, I believe, and it shouldn't in any way hinder innovation. Of course, the real strength will be in numbers, right? When enough developers use these resources and this guide to communicate their results to sponsors and regulators, that's the thing that will facilitate more harmonized communication. And more importantly, or most importantly, at least, definitely, the building a good reference measure is typically an iterative process, right? What I mean by that is if you have a well-established reference, it's probably going to exist in a standard issue by a professional body, right? And that's a fairly straightforward case. But here we're considering those novel digital clinical measures. And let's say that you only have a single self-reported reference measure available, if that, right? But let's say that you have that. The act of conducting that initial analytical validation and making that comparative analysis will make it easier for people that are coming after you, whether it's yourself or somebody else, to replicate that process for a new DHT, right? Because you've essentially set a new bar of what rigor looks like for that measure, and then you build from there.
Yeah, got to start somewhere.
Right.
Are you enjoying the conversation? We'd love to hear from you. Please subscribe to the podcast and give us a rating. It helps other people find and join the conversation. If you've got speaker or topic ideas, we'd love to hear those too. You can send them in a podcast review.
Okay, so what's the hard part in implementing the recommendation? Is it the time investment, the needed funding, especially for technology startups who must go searching for financial support, or is it general resistance to change in the pharma industry? Maybe any of that?
Yeah, it's probably all of the above, right? It's definitely a very what's the word? Like a multi-stakeholder challenge, right? So. Personally, I've designed and conducted quite a few analytical validation studies. And in my opinion, the recommendations that we make here are fairly straightforward. It's only in certain cases where the only thing you have available are these very low rigor reference measures and anchor measures. They may require more complex study and statistical designs, right? And that absolutely can extend the development timeline, as you pointed out. So it will be very important. It's always important to define your value proposition, of course. In those cases, it will be extra important to get very, very specific about what you're building for who, to assess whether or not that additional timeline is worth the time and resource investment. I think the kind of what we did in the resources is woven throughout. We make recommendations about how and when to engage regulators to have early conversations. And that's really to ensure that we, developers, other people involved in this process, don't waste time on approaches that may not meet the needs of other stakeholders, right? Now, that's a very developer-centric perspective. And obviously, there's also the pharma's sponsor perspective here. And I think the use of these resources will facilitate having that conversation between developers and pharma about what is an appropriate level of analytical validation, what is an appropriate level of rigor for a reference measure, to avoid situations which are still quite common where the sponsor feels that validation work essentially needs to be repeated in-house, right? And if a data package is assembled according to V3+, and it has a very sound and rigorous reasoning on how they went about their reference measure selection and the results of their analytical validation, that really should be a signal for a sponsor to carefully examine that data before jumping to the conclusion that only in-house validation can be trusted. And I think as a last point, definitely not least, it's my hope that the availability of these resources will also help startups, developers, to make their case to potential investors, right? Because there is something very tangible to refer to in terms of why are you planning to spend your resources this way? Why are your timelines looking like that? What's at the end of the tunnel, right?
Yeah, that makes total sense. And I know that DIME is looking to have study sponsors measure what matters most to patients, since it sets the stage for the development of drugs that impact unmet medical needs. So how does that sentiment show up in the new set of validation resources?
I really appreciate this question, because the measures that matter to patients framework is like one of those DIME resources that myself and others care deeply about, and from personal opinion, for all the right reasons. So for people less familiar, it's a resource that explains how to define a study endpoint by starting from a so-called meaningful aspect of health, right? A meaningful aspect of health meaning something that a patient or a caregiver wants to make better or doesn't want to see deteriorate further. And the resources we just launched on novel digital clinical measures don't necessarily enforce a focus on meaningful aspects of health, as they're looking at analytical validation, which is this very defined comparative analysis. But as a field, we've made a lot of progress over the last couple of years, and I would hope that any novel measure that is being considered today has been discussed with all the stakeholders, and with all stakeholders meaning patients really should be on the top of that list. I think maybe by ways of an example, about a month ago, we launched the core measures of Alzheimer's disease and related dementias, which, considering what was in your news segment, sounds timely too. These core measures were designed with and for patients and pharma to capture aspects of ADRD that patients and their caregivers care about, right? They don't want it to get worse, or they want to improve it or prevent it altogether. And DIME has a number of these core measure sets that were developed in pre-competitive consortia with pharma and DHT developers for sleep, physical activity, and nocturnal scratch, and now also ADRD. And the reason for going a little bit into this example is because it provides kind of a way to start tying a lot of these resources together and understand how they inform each other. So let's say that you want to develop a digital endpoint for an investigational Alzheimer's drug. You can start from the core measures to identify a meaningful aspect of health, work your way down to an associated endpoint, then identify a sensor-based digital health technology that can capture that endpoint. Of course, you need to assess what kind of work, if any, still needs to happen to conduct or complete V3 plus evaluation. Make sure that the analytical validation of the algorithm used to calculate the endpoint is evaluated against the most rigorously available reference measure for your context of use. Right. So that really kind of wraps up a lot of these resources together to provide this this roadmap to how you can go about this, and we can all start operating on common principles on how to discuss these things and how to evaluate them.
Yeah.
And lots of new technology is still coming out, right, every day. That's creating this kind of unprecedented opportunity for meeting patients where they are and measure things that affect clinical outcomes that patients and their immediate environment actually care about.
Yeah.
And DIME's work is really at the frontier of our current capabilities to kind of tirelessly chip away at the remaining barriers to adoption to make all of this possible.
Yeah. I want to key in on the roadmap you just mentioned to close this out here today. I think everyone would love an update on this other project that I know the Digital Medicine Society has forged with the FDA last fall, intending to create a comprehensive sort of process map for employing digital endpoints in clinical trials. And we'll be grouping, I guess, all of these resources on the topic built by DIME and the FDA and others in one central sort of online location. What can you share about progress on that sort of larger front? And when will this sort of master roadmap be available?
Yeah, indeed. And this is a project that I'm personally am very very much looking forward to seeing the end result of it, because I think we can truly build something impactful for the field here. And like you pointed out, I was kind of referencing the general concept behind it in my example about Alzheimer's.
Yep.
So DIME and others have developed quite a few resources to guide the development and implementation of digital endpoints in clinical trials. I think that much is clear. And what is maybe less clear to listeners is the scope of that work, because what we've been discussing so far has all been very focused on the more scientific aspects of making sure that something is fit for purpose. But it goes all the way to establishing that a return on investment of the implementation of a digital endpoint is actually there, right? If you're considering this as a pharma sponsor, like what are the financial drivers to make the decision to implement something in a trial, and then of course also the more scientifically focused aspects that we've been discussing here. Mm-hmm. In addition to that, the FDA has issued a lot of guidance on this topic or adjacent topics, most recently, including the new DHT guidance and the new decentralized clinical trial guidance. And so taken together, that's a lot of information that should allow developers and adopters of digital health technologies to really find a way to map out the path of least resistance. But we and FDA and others all acknowledge that it really is not as straightforward yet as it could be. We've got a lot of examples of pilot studies and feasibility studies and exploratory digital endpoints, but examples with more impact are still few and far between. So it really is a case of early adopters forging ahead. But in order to jump from early adopters to the early majority, we have to make this entire process easier to understand and transparent, including calling out all the benefits and potential challenges. So the how-to guide, as we're calling this project, is intended to solve just that. It will take stock of the current state of the field as it pertains to implementing digital endpoints and trials, and where gaps in knowledge remain, and assemble all relevant resources into a process map so that stakeholders can more proactively and faster find their way to making sure that we can all develop medical products based on data generated by the best method available to capture those valuable endpoints. So you alluded to the fact that this just launched. We kicked it off a couple of months ago. It's funded by FDA. This is slated to become available in late 2025. In the meantime, we're going to be talking to a lot of folks on the developer side, adopter side, regulator side to make sure that this really becomes a very interactive and useful resource for the entire field.
Wow, that is a lot of work on the front end for a lot of gain on the back end. I definitely want to be tracking progress on this front. Thank you so much. Ben, it is so refreshing to learn of this coordinated effort towards solving the disconnects in conversations between digital health technology companies, pharma sponsors, and regulators when it comes to the appropriate level of validation for novel clinical measures and defining reference measures. Thanks for the work you're doing on this front, and thanks for taking the time out of your busy schedule to be on the show today. Really appreciate it.
It was my pleasure. Thank you very much for having me.
You are so very welcome. As always, a big thank you to everyone out there for listening in. If you're not subscribed to this podcast yet, please consider going to Apple Podcasts and doing so right now so you don't miss your monthly dose of news and perspectives you'll be hard-pressed to find anywhere else. And if you're up for it, I'd also be so very grateful if you'd leave a rating and review while you're there. One final note, if you like today's show, it's only a glimpse of news and insights we have on tap for the next Scope event taking place in sunny Orlando, Florida. Please plan to join me there February 3rd through the 6th, 2025, and be sure to use discount code SOT10 for a 10% discount off any current rate. For more information, visit scopesummit.com. Bye for now.